Ratchet Gladiator, or Deadlocked if you're American, still does a lot of things not just better than previous games in the series, but is also more in line with the actual good games, 1 and 2. Among what Gladiator does well, maybe even the best of all the games up until this point actually, are the weapons. Looking at this list, the first thing you'll notice is how few there are. Gladiator has a total of just 10 different ones. In comparison, the first game has 13, 3 has 20, and 2 has 24, which means that Gladiator has at this point the smallest arsenal in a Ratchet and Clank game. There could be a variety of reasons for this, from not being able to implement more due to time constraints, or simply wanting to give the player a more focused experience in what is a relatively short game. Brian Hastings, Insomniac's chief creative officer at the time, had the perfect save for the lack of weapons though, because since they're so customizable, there are actually thousands of different weapons in the game.
Well, we still have weapons that are, actually we have more weapons than ever because we're allowed to customize. You'll have 10 weapons, each of which is virtually infinitely customizable. There are thousands of different combinations, literally thousands of different combinations you can do as you make your own weapons.
Bruh. Yes, the mods, and especially the Omega mods, can change the weapons slightly, but not even remotely enough for them to be considered entirely new weapons. But hey, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we start talking about modifying them, let's first take a look at the weapons themselves. The dual Vipers are my favorite iteration of the machine gun type weapon or whatever that was popularized with the blaster in the first game and has since become kind of a staple starter lineup weapon in the series from 2's Lancer and the very similar N60 Storm from 3, which you can buy upon reaching Florana. These weapons are very basic. I seem to remember calling them something like standard rapid-fire weapons without most of the Ratchet and Clank bells and whistles, and while that is still true here, they fixed some of the problems I had with its counterparts. First of all, the design. The Lancer upgrades to the Heavy Lancer, and the N60 upgrades to the N90 Hurricane, but their designs kinda betrays their function. Since both of these weapons are available very early on, they drop off hard pretty much immediately. These are not the designs of weak weapons though. I mean, look at them, they're huge. This might be a very small nitpick, but when the visual identity of the weapons are so important, then it matters. The dual Vipers are admittedly boring in comparison and are rarely seen in-game because of their small size, being easily hidden by Ratchet's character model and all. But I'd argue that this kind of design fits this type of weapon much better, and as a result it feels better to use them. Secondly, the Lancer's shots had this really nice oomph to them, which completely disappears with the increased rate of fire of the Heavy Lancer. And this is also an area where the dual Vipers dominates. They just sound really good to shoot, even as the rate of fire goes up. Lastly, unlike the Heavy Lancer, the V10 upgrade to the dual Raptors doesn't simply increase the rate of fire or powers it up, but it adds some much needed spectacle by making the shots rebound off of enemies and level geography, essentially making it a bit more of a tactical weapon as well and much more suited to taking out more than one enemy at a time. This feature was present in the level 2 version of the N60 also, except it would only ricochet off of surfaces, not enemies. In that sense, it's closer to the Golden Blaster, I guess. Oh, and the shots get slight homing capabilities, which in practice means you don't have to equip any aiming mods to have an easier time hitting enemies anymore. The Magma Cannon is pretty much the exact same weapon as the Blitzgun and Shock Blaster, though it might have a bit wider blast radius than the others. It also still has that same problem with shrapnel not hitting enemies, even when you're almost right next to them when shooting. But it seems like it's not as pervasive as the Blitz Cannon, for example, which was downright embarrassing. They also removed the charge function from 3, and thank God for that. This time it's all continuous shots if you hold down the fire button, and the weapon is much better balanced because of it. The accuracy issue isn't that much of a problem, but it's 100% fixed the moment the weapon reaches V10 and upgrades to the Vulcan cannon, where, and I'm super surprised how this wasn't an upgrade for the previous shotgun weapons, you're not shooting shrapnel anymore, but homing lasers. Now, your immediate thought might be that it's antithetical to add a homing feature to a weapon which whole purpose is to do as much damage as possible over as wide of an area as possible. But it actually works pretty well. While you're not shooting as many strands as before, the affected area is still just as big, and it's not like all the shots will all home into just one single enemy. Or, well, it will if there's just one enemy present, but in a large group, these shots will home onto enemies depending on your positioning relative to theirs. This is an upgrade that doesn't change how the weapon works, like the one in 3 that adds a death ray, which from that point on is the only viable way to use the shock cannon, but an upgrade to the effectiveness of the weapon, making all the shots hit, but still retaining that area-wide shotgun effect. It is because of this that the Magma cannon, or rather the Vulcan cannon, is my favorite interpretation of the shotgun weapon in the series so far. It's about goddamn time this weapon had a worthy iteration. Thank you, Insomniac. I think this is the first and only time I'm gonna thank Insomniac in the script. Unless you're playing local co-op, that's it for the starter weapons you get at no cost. For multiplayer, you actually get the Ps2 Obliterator for free from the start, but if you're playing single player, you'll need to buy it for 15,000 bolts, which just seems like an insane price for the first weapon, considering you'll only end up with around 6.5k after the first set of challenges. The Ps2 is a very basic grenade launcher, pretty much just like the Nitro launcher from 3 and the Gravity Bomb from 2, except it's actually lacking a few features. For one, you won't get that really cool looking shrapnel effect from 3. Actually, the blast itself doesn't look even remotely as cool as the others either. By default, when fully upgraded, it has the same amount of ammunition as the Gravity Bomb, 8 pieces, and that's too little. Though this also includes the 1 ammo mod you get at V4. Without any ammo mods, it has a meek 6 pieces of ammunition loaded up at max. Speaking of mods, I will go more into detail about them later, but there's one thing I want to bring up specifically about the Ps2, which is the inclusion of not just 1, but 2 aiming alpha mods. The first is already set when you buy it at V1, and the second is given to you when the weapon reaches V8, and it's by far the worst mod you can include here for the simple reason that the ground aiming reticle will auto-lock on to enemies. This might not sound too bad, and it's actually really nice to have on some of the other weapons, but for one that's supposed to deal damage in a radius from a set point on the ground, being unable to freely choose where that point should be is a massive downgrade to the effectiveness of the weapon. Imagine there are 3 enemies coming at you, but there's enough distance between them that the explosion won't hit all 3 if you target just one of them. With an aiming mod installed, the reticule will automatically snap to one of those enemies, effectively making it so that you'll only hit that one, while if you didn't have the aiming mod, you could comfortably aim the projectile in the middle and hit all 3 of them. Luckily, the fix here is as simple as unequipping the aiming alpha mod, but that's not exactly intuitive since that's not how the mod works with other weapons, and you gotta wonder why they even decided to include not just 1, but 2 of them in the first place when it hurts the weapon this much. I don't think it's a bad weapon though, but it's not exactly my favorite iteration like with the 2 previous ones. The Holoshield launcher is a weapon, which concept I harshly criticized in Ouya previously. Not only does the Holoshield glove straight up suck at tanking damage, but it also doesn't fit into the gameplay very well either, since you're constantly on the move and the open level design rarely forces you to stay in one place for long. Essentially, you're never, or rarely, locked down without any way out that just involves moving left or right. It's also immediately outclassed by the shield charger once you get that. The fix for the first issue is very simple. The shield now doesn't have hit points but expires after a set amount of time depending on the weapon's level. It's a very easy fix, but apparently it introduces a different problem. Since you can only have about 4 to 6 shields active at a time, and the time limit can extend to up to 54 seconds, you could be put in a situation where you'll have to wait for shields to expire when moving on from a combat encounter into a new one, but personally this was never an issue for me and I didn't even notice it. The other issue isn't that easy of a fix, but hey, they made an attempt. So for the first few levels after you're able to buy the Holoshield launcher, it's actually really useful. This thing is available right after reaching Catacomb 4, the very first planet after the introduction challenges on the Dreadzone space station, and is the 4th weapon you're able to buy. Being available so early means that you'll only have the dual Raptors, Magma Cannon, and maybe the Ps2 Obliterator at your disposal. And those aren't powerful one-hit ranged weapons, but weapons that you'll have to fire for a little bit in order to defeat most enemies, and this makes the shields very valuable. Also, since Gladiator is a much more linear game with more narrow level design, you'll often find yourself in a pinch situation where having a shield is actually very beneficial. However, this is only true for the first few planets, and afterwards you'll be playing some open levels for a little while where you'll have limited use for the shield, and then after that you have so many new and powerful weapons and mods that taking the time to put up a shield just doesn't make sense when you can just destroy most enemies with a few shots anyways. The only situations at that point that might justify popping a shield is whenever the game throws a bunch of multi-hitting enemies at you at once, like turrets or those big flying Gatling bugs. But those situations are rare, and if you're quick enough, you might be able to dispatch them fast enough so that you don't need the shield after all. So yet again, I have the same criticism. This type of weapon just doesn't fit that well into the game the way it's designed. Hell, the most damning piece of proof I have of this is that I had to go out of my way and stand in front of a turret in order to upgrade it. And this was after I had tried as best as I could to use it in a bunch of different scenarios. See, what makes this so damning is that the experience for the Holoshield is not based on killing enemies with it like the rest of the weapons, since that's almost literally impossible. It's based on the amount of hits it absorbs. So by extension, not having it upgrade fully despite using it a lot just shows that it doesn't protect you from that many projectiles to begin with. So, well, why even have it included then? Hell, they even place out these little mini shields all over the place at points where there are a lot of enemies shooting at you. I really wish I could answer the question of why. It's not like upgrading it to V10 is that worth it either. It gains the ability to shoot back when being shot at, but the damage it does is abysmal, and its only real use would be attaching the shock mod and having it kill swarmers. But since they don't shoot anything at you, the shields won't attack them. Instead, it just lets them pass right through as if they were nothing, like they do with all enemies. That's the shield's weak point. It won't do anything against melee-based enemies, and that's fine. The devs even anticipates you using the shields at some points and spawns melee enemies right behind you, creating a choke point at certain places. And that's tons of fun, but this only happens a handful of times. The rest of the time, the shield is pretty much as useless as it's always been, except if you're playing at the highest difficulty. Then you can add another half of a handful of situations where it might be helpful. On the other hand, there are also situations where it can be too helpful, like in certain boss battles. Reactor, for example, has almost purely ranged attacks, some of which can be pretty hard to dodge unless you have the Holoshield launcher, which reduces this fight to move to the side once in a while. The Ace Hardlight fight also suffers from this, but to a slightly lesser degree. The most embarrassing part is where he shoots out a homing projectile that would keep following you until it hits, but it's instantly destroyed by the Holoshields. For both fights, it's all, hey, here's this really hard to avoid attack to test your abilities, but uh-oh, it's rendered useless by a weapon you can buy on the first damn planet. I'm all for outsmarting your opponents by using a tactic to make the battle easier, but this is just negating the entire challenge, and that's not a fun thing to be able to do. It's just boring. These fights are so much more fun when you're not using the shields and you let the boss battles play out their purpose in testing the player on their mastery of the game. Which I suppose was the thinking behind the Hunter Mine Launcher? I don't know, I can't quite wrap my head around this one. At its core, this weapon is purely a defensive one, but as I've been harping on about for far too long already, this kind of gameplay does not mesh well with a defensive playstyle. The mines you place with this weapon will stay put and automatically home in on approaching enemies once they reach a certain proximity. As such, you can set traps throughout, for example, an arena, in order to eliminate enemies as soon as they spawn. That's the tactical use for this weapon, but two things prevents it from fulfilling this role in any meaningful way. The mines will only explode once, and the way enemies spawn in this game is either one after the other, or via some kind of dropship, still one by one, or even both of those methods at once. Even if you upgrade the blast radius to the max, the explosions still can't hit enemies that haven't spawned in yet. Your best bet is trying to focus the mines on the dropships so that no enemies will spawn from them, but that's impossible to plan. Enemies are also usually spawning in big groups. I'm talking 5 to 10 enemies or more of varying sizes, and they're coming at a constant stream. You can only place out 8 mines at once before you start overriding your current ones, which gives you 8 explosions, at least until the weapon reaches V10 and upgrades to the Stalker mine launcher, where you get essentially 3 explosions per unit of ammo thanks to the first mine splitting in 2. Still, the problem here is that to begin with, using it tactically like this has the huge caveat that you need to actually know where the enemies will spawn. Sure, you could also lure enemies towards the mines, but at that point the whole tactical angle gets thrown out the window. The entire reason for using a weapon tactically like this is to remove yourself from unnecessary risk, not introduce more by deliberately having enemies get close to you. Funnily enough, this is also a tactic that the weapon can be used for, since the mine launcher is the only one that will passively protect you from melee attackers. Well, as long as they're coming at you from the front. I'm not sure if this was a conscious design decision from a gameplay standpoint, or if it was just a side effect from the design of the weapon itself. Either way, I don't like it. It wastes ammo on swarmers that could just as easily have been defeated by a different weapon with more ammo, or even just a wrench. You could go all jihad on them and run up and blow up in their faces, but why? If you're going to use the Hunter Mine Launcher as an offensive weapon, you might as well throw them out in front of you instead of waiting for the enemies to approach you, except they're so slow to activate that the enemies are almost guaranteed to get a few shots off in the meantime, or even move far enough ahead so that the mines won't activate. Sure, they're more powerful than the grenades from the Ps2, but they also need to land next to an enemy, activate, and then physically touch them in order to explode. So the mine launcher isn't fit as a tactical weapon, and it isn't fit as an offensive weapon. The only thing it has going for it is placing a bunch of mines around you as a defensive wall, and then switching to a more effective means of dealing damage. And as I've already outlined, this does not mesh well with the gameplay at all. This was already an issue in the first game, which wasn't nearly as combat focused as Gladiator, so I have no idea what made them think it would work out this time around. Which brings me to the next weapon, the Flux Rifle. No, wait, the Pulse Rifle? Ah, Jesus, why do they keep copy-pasting this weapon? The Fusion Rifle is a sniper, and it has the same issues as in the previous games it's in. You have to stop moving to use it effectively. Even if you use the scope for long-range attacks, the draw distance stops you from making effective use of it, and enemies will always shoot back with pinpoint accuracy at any range as long as you don't take them out in one shot. The V10 version, the Antimatter rifle, will pierce targets, but again, there aren't that many instances where this is actually useful, at least at a distance. The thing about the Deadlocked version of the Splitter rifle is that it's not being used as a sniper rifle. In fact, I'd wager that it wasn't planned to be used as a sniper rifle at all. The vaporizer will almost exclusively be used firing from the hip, because as stated above, there's little to no reason to use the scope at all. But this is not just because of the limited draw distance, but also since, in contrast to 2 and 3, the sniper in Gladiator actually has a reticule outside of aiming down the scope, but only in lockstrafe mode. I can go on and on about how badly lockstrafing affects the game, but for now I'll just say that this seems like a quick fix for a weapon that doesn't have any place in the core gameplay loop in an attempt to force it in there. This doesn't mean that the weapon works within the game, and it's still just as useless if you're playing in third-person mode, for example, but being able to accurately aim your shots while moving around like normal does make it fit better. The Arbiter, another weapon that you'd be excused to mistake for an earlier edition, but in contrast to the Flux Rifle... okay, that wasn't part of the joke. I actually misspoke there. But in contrast to the Fusion Rifle series of weapons, there are actually noticeable changes to the different iterations of the rocket launcher. In the first game, it was very basic, with the gold version having the shots bounce around a bunch of times. In Going Commando, it was also very basic to begin with the upgraded version basically just being a straight damage upgrade that let you charge the weapon in order to fire up to 4 rockets at once. Ultimately, you were better off just firing 4 normal rockets, but whatever. The Annihilator in Up Your Arsenal gradually got a few additions, like all the weapons got, and ended up firing multiple mini-rockets from the main projectile as it hit. So how do you diversify something as simple as a rocket launcher? I think they did a pretty good job with the first 3, but apparently that's where the good ideas dried up. The Arbiter, once it upgrades to the Silencer, now fires 3 rockets at once instead of 1. From the outset, this might sound pretty good. 3 is better than 1, right? Well, yeah, if they were firing in even the remotely same direction. It's like someone installed an item from the Binding of Isaac on it, because those 2 extra shots are fired in a 45-degree angle outwards from the weapon. The purpose seems to be to have the rocket launcher be more effective against groups of enemies, but like, first of all, it's an explosive weapon. If you just fire it into the middle of a group of enemies, they're all caught in the explosion. And if you want to reach more of them, just add more area mods. Secondly, the cone is way too wide. Even in Gladiator arenas, which are among the most compact places you'll be fighting in, the side rockets completely miss their targets and end up flying into the back walls without hitting anything. The center rocket is still affected by the aiming reticule and will fly towards wherever you're aiming, but the side ones will always fly outward relative to where Ratchet is. What you can do though to try and mitigate this problem is position yourself so that the center rocket and one of the side rockets will fly towards the same place, something I actually got pretty good at towards the end. But there's still that last rogue one flying into God knows where, that's completely wasted. But hey, at least they managed to make a unique rocket launcher for Gladiator, right? Speaking of unique weapons, the Scorpion Flail. Well, kind of. I think this weapon is heavily inspired by the previous melee weapon in the series, the Plasma Whip, with a few cosmetic changes to make it feel unique. But hey, I really like the Plasma Whip, and I really like the Scorpion Flail as well. It upgrades to the Leviathan Flail, but despite having a much cooler name, the actual change is minimal. In fact, I never really noticed anything. I had to have it pointed out to me that it leaves behind a shockwave when it hits the ground, but it seems like that's merely a visual flare to signal a wider reach more than an actual feature. What sets it apart from the Plasma Whip is a greater focus on attacking enemies directly in front of you. But as it levels up and gains more area mods, the reach extends to an area even a bit behind Ratchet, it seems. I don't think the reach has as large of an increase forward though. It seems like a bit of an asynchronous increase to the impact zone that's slightly leaning towards Ratchet rather than outward from the spike ball. So in the same way the Plasma Whip basically snakes all the way around Ratchet, the Scorpion Flail eventually also damages enemies with about the same reach, maybe even a bit further ahead, but also enemies that are airborne or above you in general, since Ratchet is swinging this thing over his shoulder, which is something that makes the flail even better and more useful than the whip. The thing about the Plasma Whip in Ouya was that it often didn't do enough damage to stagger enemies, which would give them a lot of time to counterattack while you were in the middle of the attack animation. And these were mostly melee enemies, so they'd be right beside you. This meant that the whip could only realistically be used safely against swarmer enemies. With the flail, it's a bit different, because not only does it have a base knockback stat that's higher than the whip, but you could even modify it with impact mods if this were to be a problem, or even better, just add the freeze Omega mod to it that's available around the same time. The level design also favors a melee weapon like this because of the narrow corridors and tight arena spaces. Even the enemies are a good mix of melee and range types, and even the big scary ones usually have a delay before they attack, which when combined with the rocket boots gives you enough time to get in close and personal with the flail. Defeating droves of enemies with this weapon is truly a blast, especially with the freeze mod. There's something very special about using a huge wrecking ball to literally smash a bunch of enemies into pieces all at once. With that said, this is rarely a weapon I will have equipped and ready to go outside of combat because of one thing: the horrible sound it makes as it's dragged along the ground when Ratchet moves. This is maybe the worst sound design decision I have ever witnessed. Yes, even worse than the bouncer in the previous games. And the reason for how this came to be is so fucking dumb too. So the devs struggled to prevent the ball from clipping through the ground because of its size. They could have made it smaller, but if they did that, it wouldn't look as intimidating. And I do get that from a visual standpoint, but does the fact that it clips into the ground even matter? I mean, every weapon will clip into the walls if you stand too close, and there's no special sound for that, right? It's not like there aren't more severe graphical discrepancies, even in the Ps2 version. And for the final nail in the coffin, who the hell even cares? Like seriously, I'm pretty sure I never would have even noticed it clipping into the ground if not for the horrible grating sounds. It's a shame too, because it makes an otherwise awesome weapon lose a few points in my mind. Going from the most manual weapon to the most automatic weapon, here's the last regular one of the bunch: the mini turret launcher. Because I guess a glove wasn't hardcore enough for Ratchet and Clank's dark emo phase. They, for some reason, went control set on that whole teleport along with you feature, most likely because it didn't work, if I had to guess, but other than that, it's pretty much the exact same weapon. The only significant upgrade is that upon reaching V10, instead of shooting homing rockets, the turrets now shoot piercing shots, something along the likes of the pulse rifle. This makes it so they can hit multiple enemies at once, but as for how effective they are, well, not very. Hey, at least it's better than the rockets. Despite what I've said about the mini turrets in previous games, I like this version much better, mostly because this time around the weapon actually makes sense to use thanks to the change in level design direction. Well, for the most part. It still doesn't work that well in the big open levels, but the amount of enemies that usually spawn in centered around one place kinda makes up for that. Not completely though, but it makes way more sense to place out a couple of turrets when you know you'll be staying at one place for a longer period of time. Where the mini turret launcher really shines though is, of course, during the Gladiator arena sections, which there are a lot of. Like the Hunter Mine Launcher, this is a weapon where you place out a couple of units and let them work autonomously. But unlike the mines, which needs to be refilled almost constantly, the turrets actually have a decent longevity to them, and can take out a bunch of enemies with just one piece of ammunition, which leaves you able to run around and take out strays with your other weapons without worrying too much about the turrets running out. They also, from what I've noticed, now attack enemies even if they're not in the view of the camera, which makes it less likely for enemies to be able to sneak up on you from behind. The only drawback is that you can only have 5 of them running at any time. You can place out more than 5, but in those cases only the ones closest to Ratchet will be active. One thing I do not like about this weapon though is how misleading the speed mod is for it. It doesn't have any effect on the speed of the turrets themselves, which would be what you'd expect, right? Hell, it would be nice because of the downgrade in fire rate when it upgrades to the Mega Turret Launcher, but no. The speed mods, hilariously, considering you only get speed and ammo mods as it levels up, only has an effect on the turret dispense rate of the launcher itself. The need to place out 5 turrets as quickly as possible is pretty limited. It's not like with the Hunter Mines where they might explode and disappear the second they land on an enemy, right? The turrets will stay out for a while no matter what. The Harbinger is Gladiator's ultimate Rhino type weapon. Strangely enough, it's available to buy as soon as the Liberator tournaments, which is the third to last set of challenges, but it's sitting at a pretty 2 million bolts, so there's no way you'd actually be able to afford it until challenge mode anyways, unless you grind challenges over and over again. It's just a really weird decision to reveal it this early. Anyways, the Harbinger, and by extension its upgraded form, the SuperNova, is kind of a mix between the original Rhino and the Rhino 3. It shares more DNA with the Ouya version since it's, by all standards, a screen-clearing weapon, but the rockets shooting out of it reminds me of the original from Rack 1. If you're going to have a screen-clearing weapon, then this is by far my preferred way to do it, especially considering the disorienting mess of a weapon the Rhinocerator is. It's pretty much a press button to win weapon, but there are a few balancing tricks used, like having the weapon take a little while to activate or have a very limited ammo capacity, and that's fine. The relatively long animation adds to the spectacle, and having limited ammo makes you choose your battles. It's not as much of a tactical weapon like the Rhino 2, but there's at least some level of thought behind using this compared to the Rhinocerator and its massive 50 unit ammo capacity. The only problem I truly have with this weapon is that it's not made very clear just when enemies take damage from firing it off. You will probably learn the ins and outs eventually just by observing what happens on screen, but it's still kinda confusing when you first start using it. The thing is that the Harbinger only has an effect on enemies that are within view the very instant you press the fire button. This is misleading because of the previously mentioned animation that plays before the orbital lasers actually fires off and creates a bit of a visual dissonance that doesn't happen with any other weapon in the game. This is the same problem the Rhinocerator had, I believe, but I still have no idea why it's like this. And that's all the weapons. Yes, there aren't a lot of them, but I truly think that they did well with what they had. Despite me tearing into weapons like the Hunter Mines, Fusion Rifle, and Holoshields, I still think they're utilized okay enough. Compared to the previous titles, there aren't weapons I think are downright bad, and most of them are my favorite iterations so far of their respective weapon types. What I don't get though is the decision to include these weapons specifically. There's not really an answer to why out there either. The closest I could get was Mike Stout saying that this was supposed to be an all-star collection of weapons from across the earlier games. But if that was the case, then what's the Flux Rifle, Hunter Mine Launcher, and Holoshield Launcher doing here? And where are fan favorites like the Bouncer, the Lava Gun, or the Bomb Glove? Oh, wait, I'm the only one that likes that last one? It's puzzling, but I think the answer lies in the multiplayer aspect of Gladiator. Online multiplayer was a big focus for them this time, and unlike Ouya, you could use all the main weapons except the Harbinger in the PvP modes. These servers has since shut down, but thanks to the awesome people over at Ps.org, it's still possible to experience these modes, and they're fun, they really are. But speaking with some of the online veterans in the Discord server, which I'll link to in the description, I learned that the only weapons that are considered fun are the fusion rifle, magma cannon, and B6 obliterator, and this is why these are the only weapons you'll see during the footage of the online matches. The rest of them are considered either useless, or in the case of the Hunter Mine Launcher, way too OP and difficult to manage. And yeah, I can totally see that. It's kind of funny how they completely butchered the balancing on the mines though, because I have a sneaking suspicion that, along with the fusion rifle, holoshields, and maybe even the mini turrets, these weapons were specifically included in the game to be used in the multiplayer mode. This is just speculation though, as there's no official statement out there that I could find, at least. But online PvP isn't the only multiplayer mode there is. New to Gladiator is a local split-screen co-op mode, and this is actually really fun, and lets you play through the entire game with a friend. The way this works is that you each control a character, and you have a shared pool of weapons, which are unlocked just as you would in the normal game mode. I'm not sure why you're not allowed to use the same weapon for both characters, but it is possible when grinding, or whenever the game bugs the fuck out. It's probably an issue with keeping track of your ammo, and not anything technical, if I had to guess. Anyways, as we played this mode, I slowly realized that there's an actual use for weapons like the Hunter Mines and Fusion Rifle when you have a second player that can draw the aggro so that you can sit back and place some trap mines or snipe enemies from afar. So even for the weapons that doesn't work that well in single player mode, the co-op mode kinda justifies them being there. When playing co-op and you have a shared pool of weapons though, you can't help but wish there were a few more to choose from. As a stopgap for the lack of weapons, it seems like Insomniac thought, hey, what if you can just upgrade the weapons into infinity? Well, 99 is not exactly infinity, but it sure feels like it. In challenge mode, you're able to buy the mega versions of the weapons that you've upgraded to V10, and this lets you upgrade them even further to a maximum level of 99. When upgrading from 1 to 10, the weapons all need different amounts of XP for each level, but for the mega versions, every level requires the same amount of XP, which feels a bit odd, but whatever. Does it work though? No, not really. There's not any content here, it's just brain-dead slop to keep pumping dopamine into people as they replay the game. You could make an argument about how this is basically what they did in 3, but the max level there was 8. Even after purchasing the mega weapons, and while the weapons didn't gain any new features there either, they also didn't gain a level after killing one group of enemies. A bit hyperbolic, yes, but it seriously feels like that sometimes. The mega weapons were always meant as something to work towards for people who wanted to replay the game, but this is just way too much. The upgrades aren't even that good, barely increasing the power of the weapons for each level. By the way, you get these upgrade screens whenever a weapon levels up from 1 to 10, and then every 10th level afterwards, but there's not really any reason to have these except for showcasing that the damage actually does go up. It's not like in 3 where you'd see actual changes being done to the weapon or anything, except for when it changes form at V10, and watching the dual Raptors get a whole 2 more damage when leveling them from 19 to 20 is more sad than anything. You also won't get this upgrade screen when the weapon reaches 99, which almost makes you think there's another level to be gained, but nope, that's it. And your only reward is that the shots are now rainbow colored. Whoop-de-doo. And to make matters even worse, the cool design changes from when the weapons reaches their full potential are also gone. They still change their looks a little bit, but even that is overselling it. There's barely any changes made to most of them, ranging from minor visual draw to near unnoticeable. Hell, the difference in visual design between the Harbinger and the SuperNova is, well, nothing! The weapon just doesn't change shape. At all. I wish I could say that I was surprised at how misguided Insomniac was when making these decisions, but as we've come to learn, this is just par for the course at this point. I think the reason for not including more weapons and instead implementing that V99 BS was obviously because of the lack of time and resources, even if Insomniac doesn't like to admit that. I'd probably believe them if they said they wanted a more focused experience and decided on a highly curated set of weapons in order to bring out the strengths of the level design, but that's not the path they went down at all. Instead, during the pre-release interviews, they admitted that Yes, there are not as many weapons as we're used to, but they also kept talking up the mod system and how it would result in essentially thousands of different weapons.
You'll have 10 weapons, each of which is virtually infinitely customizable. There are thousands of different combinations, literally thousands of different combinations you can do as you make your own weapons. So you have a mod system where you get lots and lots and lots of mods, and you have mod slots in each weapon. So you can mix and match the different mods and create weapons that will do pretty much anything. It might start out as a mine glove, but then you'll apply the napalm mod. And napalm is one of the coolest effects. You'll see it in just a second. But it spreads this hot, fiery magma all over the ground. Or you could put that onto, say, the sniper rifle, something like that. And you can get completely different weapons just by mixing the different mods and the functional upgrades, which will give your weapon different abilities.
Imagine that! A mod system that would allow you complete freedom in how your weapons works, with them changing drastically depending on your mod setup. How on earth would Insomniac manage that with a paltry 1 year of dev time between the release of 3 and Gladiator?
There you go, pal. See you in another year or so.
What did he mean by that?
The answer is that they didn't. The way mods worked in 2, where they were first introduced,
Put it in the slot.
was as simple predetermined upgrades for each weapon that could be bought with titanium bolts, that game's main hidden collectible. Yeah, not a very good idea, and they remedied this in 3, where weapons would instead unlock modifications and gain ammo capacity as they leveled up. But while these upgrades often helped with the weapon's utility, and even changed them up a bit along the way until fully upgraded, their final versions had pretty much the same upgrades you'd expect from 2's upgrades and mods combined, and they were also weapon specific there. In Gladiator, they take this one step further, and while I appreciate the system in 3 a bit more with their gradual increase in utility, like bouncing shots for the N60 at V2 or homing bomblets for the Annihilator at V3, I really like the customization aspect here, but not for Gladiator. Rather, as far as I remember, I like the implementation of this kind of upgrade system much better in Tools of Destruction. Listen, I appreciate the attempt, and for what it's worth, this is a good first step, but it's not as revolutionizing of a system as Insomniac wanted it to be. And even after multiple revisions, it still isn't. They never truly went back to this amount of customizability. Instead, they went for more of a skill tree solution for each weapon, and compared to the mod system in Gladiator, I think the former approach is the better one while still retaining some sort of player-driven customizability. So the way the system in Gladiator works is that each weapon can be equipped with up to 10 alpha mods and 1 omega mod. Omega mods become available for purchase gradually throughout the game, just like the weapons, and once purchased can be used across multiple weapons at a time. Every weapon has 1 Omega mod slot, but not every weapon can be modified with every Omega mod. The Acid, Shock, Freeze, Morph, and Brainwash mods are applicable to all the weapons, while the Napalm, Minibomb, and Time Bomb mods are only applicable to weapons with explosive projectiles. Not all of these are made equal though. The Acid mod is pretty okay. Whenever you hit an enemy with a shot, it applies a dot, or damage over time debuff, to them. It's the first one you'll have access to, so it'll see a bit of use just because of that. It feels like it helps at least a little bit, especially early on when you don't have access to the big kaboomy weapons yet, but after a while you'll be defeating enemies so fast that the dot won't have a lot of time to go into effect, and it's pretty much outclassed by other mods once you get them. I'm also not sure how the damage calculations are done. Actually, I don't know how any of the damage calculations for the Omega mods work. I think they're based on the damage of the weapons, since they all still do a bit of damage later in the game. At the very least, I don't think it's a static amount from the time you buy them. However, I might be wrong on this, so take that with a grain of salt. The only weapon I consistently use the Acid mod on in late game is the Magma cannon, since it can very effectively apply it to multiple enemies. The Napalm mod is only equipable on explosive weapons, and the reason for this is that it spreads huge puddles of lava centered around the impact zone of the projectile, sometimes even landing on enemies and sticking to them, dealing damage over time, even if they were to move away from the affected area. This is another reason why you don't want to have aim mods on the V6, since without it you can more effectively get the magma to spawn on top of the larger enemies. The lava can also be used as a zoning tool to dispatch of swarmers or other enemies that has to cross it to get to you, which is yet another reason it pairs so well with the B6. I'd argue that the mine launcher is also a pretty good fit thanks to the proximity factor, but the lava spray can be a bit unreliable, which is why I don't like using it for the Arbiter, since that weapon is usually used for taking out the big enemies enemies who usually don't move around a lot, and trying to have the lava land on them in order to maximize the damage potential can be kinda hard because of how the projectile always hits them face on, and it seems like the lava usually spreads more to the sides instead of forwards or backwards. The shock mod is downright broken when dealing with swarmers. Like, seriously, you can take out an almost unlimited amount of them with a single shot from the dual vipers, which is why that's my go-to weapon for this mod. It also helps that the bouncing shots from the dual Raptors helps apply the effect more times for the bigger enemies, essentially spreading out even more damage. Other than that, there's not much else to say about this mod. It's mainly purely for increased damage, so like the acid one, it's pretty straightforward. The freeze mod, however, is more of a control type mod, which will slow down all movement of enemies you hit, which makes it fitting for the Scorpion Flail specifically because of not only its insane reach, but also how it's a melee weapon, so if you use this effectively, you're basically untouchable, even from ranged enemies, as long as you manage to get to them before they've reached the point in their animation where they fire off their projectiles. This is the first mod that applies its effect in steps too. This basically means that the more damage a weapon deals, the higher a percentage of the effect is applied. So using the Vipers for this, we'll see the effect being more gradually applied in comparison to a heavy hitting weapon like the Flail. This is why I don't view the mod as that effective on the Vipers or Magma cannon, because of their relative low damage output. But damn man, you literally can't go wrong with this mod on anything. Well, maybe except the Holoshields. It's by far the best mod in the entire game, and totally overshadows almost everything else just because of how useful it is. Of course, it's going to be a bit boring having the same mod on every weapon, so a good option for some much needed visual flair is the Mini-Bomb mod. Thankfully, without as bad sound design as with the Bouncer. It feels like the bomblets hitting the ground have been muted a bit. That or the Scorpion Flail makes the audio seem way better in comparison. Anyways, this mod makes your explosive weapons into the Bouncer, so I guess that's where that weapon went. It's more of a different version of the Napalm mod, where you're more likely to hit with the added damage because of the slight homing capabilities of the bomblets, which really helps with weapons like the Arbiter. The trade-off is, of course, that the damage potential is lower than from the Napalm mod, since there's a set amount of bomblets released per shot that won't persist on the field like the lava does. I appreciate the mod, but seeing as I was never that big a fan of the Bouncer to begin with, I usually only use it on the Arbiter, since it synergizes tolerably well with the triple shot, where you still might have a small chance to deal some damage with that rogue third rocket. I strongly dislike the Morph mod. Listen, I liked the concept of a morph weapon in the previous games, and to be fair, the mod works in a similar fashion in Gladiator, but there are two huge things wrong with it. The first is that since there's no dedicated weapon, you'll end up using up ammunition for whichever weapon you have the mod equipped on, which wouldn't be that big of a problem if the morphed enemies actually helped out enough for it to be worth it. It might be for swarmers, but for the bigger enemies? No. Not at all. They'll just stand around, and I'm not sure the explosions even deals that much damage. The ducks will lay some explosive eggs, but again, I don't think they do that much. The second problem is that this mod will literally waste your time. The way most of the enemy encounters in this game works, and especially in the arena setting, is that the game will spawn groups of enemies which needs to be defeated, either all of them or most of them, before the next group spawns. Enemies that are turned into animals still count as undefeated enemies for some ungodly reason. The best example of this is during the Crusader Dread Challenge zombie attack, where you need to survive an endless onslaught for 2 minutes and 15 seconds. This is a pretty hard challenge, especially on the hardest difficulty, but with the morph mode, you can just transform all the enemies and throw your legs up while you wait for the timer to tick down, at least until the animals explode by themselves. This is obviously a bug in the player's favor, but it's the same in all challenges, timed or not, which makes you need to kill the animals yourself for the level to progress, and that's a huge pain in the ass, and makes the mod next to unusable for me. Speaking of unusable mods, the Brainwash mod. Jesus fucking Christ, Insomniac. Why do you keep insisting on including this shitty fucking idea that does not work time after time after time? You should have realized in the course of Rack 3 that you don't know how to write the necessary code for this. I will never understand how any of these weapons passed even the first QA test. They're that bad. Admittedly, I really appreciate that it's a mod this time around so that they didn't completely waste a weapon slot for it, and that I don't have to go through the trouble of upgrading a useless piece of shit weapon that's never going to see the light of day again the moment I'm done with it. But somehow, they managed to make it even worse. I mean, holy fuck guys, look at this. I'd be laughing my head off if I wasn't so baffled at how Insomniac managed to include this untested, unrefined, and unfitting gameplay gimmick for the second fucking time. It's not about the enemies not being able to hit literally anything but the ground either. In order to have the brainwashing go into effect, you need to damage them up to a certain point with a weapon, just like with the freeze and morph mods. The problem is that with the 2 other mods that works like this, the enemies are supposed to die, or get transformed, I guess. So you don't have to carefully manage the enemies' remaining HP so that they won't get destroyed before they have a chance to actually do something while brainwashed. This works alright with the big enemies, but with the medium ones, you're barely a few shots away from killing them once the brainwashing happens, even with the dual Raptors. So not letting go of the fire button and accidentally killing the enemy instead is a very common occurrence. And if that wasn't enough, your stupid ass combat bots won't stop firing at the brainwashed enemy either, destroying it almost immediately. So what's the fucking point? This gimmick is a constant reminder of Insomniac's work culture, where they'll overreach and fail in the face of reality when time doesn't work in their favor, and they ultimately just have to ship the game as it is. I have no doubt that they could make this work if they had the extra months, okay? It's just that they have no idea how to budget time, and this is apparent in almost all of their games. The thing that makes the Brainwash mod even more of an embarrassment is that it's available almost at the end of the game at a whopping 150,000 bolts. Bitch, I wouldn't buy this mod for 5k, much less 150. I wish I could say that this last one is good, and from the outside looking in, it looks really cool at least, but the Time Bomb mod feels more like spectacle over utility. I really like this lightning effect that covers the screen whenever the mod goes off, but that's pretty much all I like about it. It apparently makes the weapon it's equipped to deal significantly more damage and cover a much larger area, but I never really noticed that much of a difference. I think it has something to do with how it takes a couple of seconds to activate after it's latched onto an enemy. It sacrifices the speed of execution for an increased damage output, but I think the latter cancels out the former and results in a net 0 increase in DPS. But that's not the only problem with the mod, because for it to activate you need to hit the enemies directly with the projectiles. You'd think that the Hunter Mine Launcher would be the optimal weapon to use with this mod, but that just amplifies its problems, making the mines activate even slower. Since the projectile needs to make physical contact with the target, the B6 is pretty much out of the running, and using it with the Arbiter takes away that satisfying feeling of a rocket exploding just as it hits an enemy. There's a clear tier list to the Omega mods, but sadly the Freeze mod is so damn good that the rest might as well be sharing the F spot. Alright, maybe I'll give the Shock mod an E because it's the only one that has that swarm and multi-kill utility. Oh, and the Brainwash mod gets a set. No, but seriously, while you can find some use for all of the mods, except the Brainwash mod, the Freeze mod is so good from a utility standpoint that it doesn't matter how much damage you can deal with the others, because at the end of the day, you want to do more damage in order for the enemies to not have a chance to attack you, and with the freeze effect slowing them down immediately upon getting hit, this gives you enough time to dispatch of them before they get off even a single shot. Besides, the other mods doesn't give you that much added damage anyways, so you might as well just lean all the way into disrupting the enemies' attacks. The only time the freeze mod is useless is during boss fights or against vehicles and turrets, but thanks to the customizable nature of the mod system, you can pretty much just pop into the weapon sections and change the mods around at any point in the game. And once you found a mod that suits a weapon, chances are you won't be changing them around much, if at all, because there's really not any reason to. They won't noticeably change up the gameplay, and the ones that tries to fails miserably. So then, what about the alpha mods? The Omega mods essentially changes the projectiles of the weapons and the effects of the impact, while the alpha mods has more of an effect on the base weapon itself, though not as much as you might think. Alpha mod slots and a default pre-slotted mod are unlocked for every weapon level up to V10. All the weapons share a common limited pool of alpha mods, but not all weapons can use all of the mods. Certain mods, like the aiming mod, can't be equipped to weapons without a reticule, like the Hunter Mine Launcher for example, and area mods can't be equipped on weapons that are single target or use non-explosive projectiles, like the dual Vipers. Going over the mods, the aiming mod gives weapons a set amount of auto aim, with the first one adding a reticule when in third person mode to weapons like the dual Vipers and Arbiter, without which are much harder to aim normally even in lock strafe mode. As I mentioned earlier though, having one equipped on the B6 is actually diminishing the weapon's effectiveness, since it prevents you from freely aiming in the middle of groups of enemies, since with even just one mod, it'll snap to the nearest foe. As far as I know, this is the only time an alpha mod effectively makes a weapon worse, though, unless you count the instances where I managed to lock onto an enemy that was hiding behind the walls. So I chalk that up to an oversight. You can equip multiple mods of the same type to a weapon in order to increase its effectiveness, but I'm not sure if this has any noticeable effect for the aiming mod after the first one. It, at the very least, has diminishing returns, and from what tests I've done, equipping multiple aim mods seems very underwhelming. The speed mod upgrades the weapon's firing speed, but as I mentioned from the Minotaur launcher, this is only true for the speed of the weapon itself and not the stuff they dispense. But this is really only an issue with the Minotaurs. The speed mod is the most straightforward way to increase the DPS of your weapons, but without a mix of ammo mods, and in the case of weapons with an area of effect, area mods, you'll be burning through your ammunition really fast without that much of a reach, so you'll never want to equip only speed mods. The ammo mod increases the ammunition capacity of weapons, though it's on a weapon by weapon basis. The dual Vipers, for example, gets an increase of 20 shots and an additional 2 ammo from pickups per ammo mod installed, while the B6 gets an additional 2 shots per ammo mod. But for weapons like this with a small ammunition pool, you'll get a different amount of extra pickups depending on how many ammo mods you have equipped within a threshold. For the B6, it's 1 ammo per mod up to 6, and then 2 extra from pickups when you have 7 or more ammo mods equipped on the weapon. The impact mod increases the knockback stat on weapons. Most weapons will have some amount of knockback to them from the start, but this mod helps by not only increasing the stagger rate, but also increasing the time it takes for the enemies to get back up. It's only really useful against land-based enemies though, excluding turrets, vehicles, and bosses, since those won't even get staggered, much less knocked back. Flying enemies also won't get knocked back, which makes the impact mod unoptimal against them, but at least they'll stagger them. You also can't stun lock enemies by equipping a bunch of impact mods, since they have some sort of immunity to it for at least a couple of seconds after getting staggered, which is yet another reason why the impact alpha mod pales in comparison to the freeze omega mod. Like seriously, if you want to stagger enemies with the weapons that don't have a core amount of knockback, just equip them with the freeze mod. Even having more than 1 or 2 impact mods on a weapon is useless since the stagger is based on how much damage you've dealt to the enemy, much like the freeze, morph, and brainwash omega mods. So you're much better off just equipping more speed mods, which not only will speed up the stagger intervals, but also increase the weapon's DPS. It's a win-win situation, and even more true for explosive weapons, where you might not even have to equip a single impact mod, and instead replace them with speed mods for essentially the same outcome. The area mod is probably the most useful one after the ammo and speed mods, but can only be equipped to weapons with an area of effect, like explosive weapons or the Flail, understandably so. This is probably the mod with the most bang for your buck, as it massively increases the radius of your area of effect weapons. It's essentially what the speed mod is to single target weapons, in that it increases damage output significantly for big groups of enemies. Add some speed mods to that, and weapons like the Scorpion Flail with the freeze mod is essentially unstoppable. That only leaves what I'd call the special alpha mods. These are pretty simple and doesn't really affect gameplay at all. The Jackpot and XP mods increases bolt and EXP gain by 50% when killing enemies with the weapon you've equipped them on, and the Nano Leech mod gives enemies a chance to drop nanotech orbs when killed. Personally, I rarely use the first two and never use the last one. I just don't think there's ever any need for it and would rather have other mods on. For the Jackpot and XP mods, there's really no reason to use them unless you're specifically grinding bolts or EXP, which will help you in the post-game to upgrade your weapons to V99, or more importantly, actually afford more Jackpot and XP mods. So alpha mods are actually kind of weird. They'll unlock along with your weapons leveling up, and during your first playthrough, this is the only means of getting your hands on them. The only problem is that they're already equipped to your weapons, so changing them around means unequipping them from one weapon and then equipping them on another. And you can do that, but the alpha mods that are unlocked on their respective weapons usually works to make that weapon better. If you want to add speed mods to the V6 to make it fire a bit faster, you have no other choice than to steal those mods from the Dual Vipers, for example, which is a weapon that heavily relies on the extra speed to stay relevant throughout the game. You could of course use the discarded mod from the B6 on the Dual Vipers, but you won't want to exchange an ammo mod or area mod for a speed mod, because it will severely downgrade the weapon and you can't even use the area mod on the Vipers, which leaves only the aiming mod or an impact mod, both of which are mostly useless and not a good trade for a speed mod, especially for the Vipers. The sad truth about the alpha mod system, despite being a very good idea, is that you don't really have to interact with it in order to have viable weapons, even in the highest difficulties. Hell, you can't even really interact with it during the time when you're most likely to need to, in your first playthrough, because it's too much of a pain to go in and out of the weapon screen in order to customize your weapons, removing mods from one and then placing them over on the weapon you want to use for a very minimal advantage, and then doing it all over again once you want to use a different weapon. Sure, you could take mods from a weapon you're sure you're not going to use, but this is only realistically possible near the end of the game when you have more weapons to choose from. Not to mention, adding ammo mods of course doesn't give you more ammo to use, it just increases your base capacity, so unequipping ammo mods will bring your ammo count down, but then not back up once you re-equip them, so changing the ammo mods around at least doesn't make sense in the middle of a level. You're actually much better off just leaving the mods as they are unlocked on the weapons because they actually work pretty well, at the very least well enough to not need to make any changes. It becomes easier to justify customizing the weapons in challenge mode, where you can actually buy an unlimited amount of alpha mods, but they are way too expensive for what they add to the game. Even with the 20 times bolt multiplier, it takes ages to grind up the bolts you need to buy the mods you want, when just one ammo mod costs 300,000 bolts. And that's the cheapest of the mods that are actually useful. The speed mod goes for 400k and the area mod for 500k. These prices are insane. You could argue that you can easily grind bolts with the jackpot mod, but 1, you only get 2 from upgrading weapons, and 2, they cost a whopping 3 million bolts each. That's the same price as the Mega SuperNova, the most expensive weapon in the game. And even then, the Nano Leech mod sits at a mind-blowing 5 million bolts apiece. What? The alpha mod system might seem deep on the surface, but in reality, it's really not. The mods doesn't even give you enough information to properly assess their strengths and how to use them. They never elaborate on how much more speed the speed mods give you, how large of an increase in effect radius the area mods give you, and on and on and on. And it's sad, because there's definitely some potential here. It's just that Insomniac is not the developer to give this kind of system the time it needs to shine. They would rather spend their time fixing a problem they themselves introduced to the game. So there's not just Ratchet that has weapons in this game. There's also the combat bots. I know I tore into the helper bots in 3, but these are slightly better. To begin with, when they kill enemies, the EXP from those kills actually goes towards your currently equipped weapon, even if you haven't tagged the enemies first, so you won't end up fighting against them. Except when you try to use the Brainwash mod. Sadly, it doesn't work like this with the vehicles, but I digress. In order for them to be effective in combat, they gradually get access to upgrades, which you can buy at Al's garage or something, I guess. These different weapons and upgrades usually unlocks after each rank tournament. The bots start out with the Pistol Flux LX, a standard gun that shoots stuff. You'll eventually have access to the BOGO, a miniature grenade launcher that might blow stuff up, and then the Range Warrior, which, oh my fucking god! They managed to include this weapon twice? Yeah, it's supposed to help the bots hit enemies from further away, but honestly, I barely ever noticed the bots using anything other than the basic pistols for combat. Now, this might be because it's hard to notice this stuff in the middle of battle, but knowing this company, I bet they just forgot to write the code for it or something. These are not weapons that you as the player has any involvement in other than actually buying them. The bots are supposed to cycle between them depending on the situation by themselves. You do have some input though. For the weapons, this comes in the form of the Alpha Ravager, which is later upgradable to the Beta Ravager. These are super weapons that charges up as the bots deal and take damage, and can be activated by pressing up on the D-pad when this bar is full. I really like the Alpha Ravager. It's an explosive, laser-emitting disco ball that disintegrates every enemy on screen. I don't understand why you'd want to upgrade to the Beta Ravager though. This makes one of the bots shoot out a flaming arrow of some kind that's supposed to jump from enemy to enemy, I think. But it rarely seems like it works as intended, so in reality, it's a downgrade. It also doesn't help that the bots aren't very smart. This also applies to the Alpha Ravager, where they'll sometimes throw the ball out in a random direction, even away from the enemies. But the worst part is when they get stuck in the geometry and doesn't show up to do the stuff you're ordering them to. Insomniac really oversold these guys' capabilities during pre-release interviews, but then again they did this with pretty much every aspect of the game, as we've seen so far.
He's accompanied with a squad of 2 bots, 2 combat bots, and he can give tactical orders to these. So at any given time, he can order them to man a turret, or to defend a position, or to lob an EMP grenade, all sorts of different things. And the interface to it is really intuitive.
I'll take poorly aged statements for $500, Alex. Anyways, the weapons aren't that connected to the problem I mentioned earlier, but it seems like they're there essentially to justify the bots coming along with you, which would explain why they're so half-assed. In fact, it seems like the bots themselves was a last-second addition, seeing as they have absolutely no presence in the cutscenes, and the few voice lines they have are just one-liners and devoid of any substance. The real purpose for the bots is to supply the player with this game's gadgets. In co-op, these are shared between the players, just like the weapons are, except you don't have access to the Ravagers, sadly. Using gadgets in co-op is actually a very fun gameplay gimmick. Usually when you use the hacker to activate orbs or the wrench to activate bolt cranks, the game will spawn in enemies, which automatically aggroes the character that's currently interacting with the orbs or cranks, and this shifts the focus over to protecting the one interacting with these instead of just killing enemies normally. With the bots, this is handled much the same, except there's a huge lack of risk, since if the bots end up dying, all you need to do is press down on the D-pad and wait a few seconds for them to be revived. You could argue that this works the same with co-op, but not only is the respawn timer much longer, the difficulty is also ramped up significantly when compared to the same difficulty mode in single player, so the loss of the second player has much bigger ramifications than the loss of one of the combat bots, which barely deals any meaningful damage anyways. Seriously, the only thing these bots are good for from a gameplay standpoint is drawing aggro away from the player and soaking up damage in order to have them unleash a Ravager shot. Relegating these gadgets to the bots removes a lot of the challenge from missions where they're in the spotlight, like the King of the Leviathans mission on Zarathos, the mission Refinery Ambush on Orxen, and especially for the mission Shields Up on Stygia, or any mission where you have access to a vehicle really. You can just sit back and revive them over and over and over again. And while this is also partially true for multiplayer, at least in co-op there's an actual human player doing these things. Having the bots use these gadgets and not protecting them from attacks will eventually get a bit tedious though, because of all the time you'll have to spend reviving them. This is where the Shield Link gadget comes into play. After it's been purchased, whenever you press the right D-pad button to have one of the bots crank the bolt, hack the orb, or pull out their grind cable,
You did it, Ratchet. Now, come.
You can press the same button again to have the other bot protect the first one by forming an impenetrable shield around it. As I mentioned earlier, the enemies usually aggroes the bot that is doing whatever action you've set them to, but with the shield link in play, this is kind of up in the air. Enemy AI in any of the PlayStation 2 Ratchet and Clank games really is not very smart. And a lot of this has to do with technical limitations, so there's no real fix other than the hacks that Insomniac had already implemented. But enemies not shifting targets over to the shield linker, if they're already focused on the first bot before it's being protected, sure sounds like a mistake to me. It also seems very random which bot is getting aggroed when one of them are being protected. In the Shields Up mission, I had an instance where I didn't have to do anything because the enemies kept targeting the shielded one, which let them hack all the orbs without any problems. The enemy AI is bad, but hey, the bot AI is almost even more janky. There's been a lot of times where they've gotten stuck beneath platforms, especially when being instructed to put up grind rails, and also failing to hit turrets with EMP grenades multiple times, either because of poor aim, because they get stuck, or because they take so long to get over that the turret will destroy them before they get within range. You'd think that when this happens to one of the bots, the other one could take over, but no, apparently not. That's not to say that the co-op mode is without its problems either. The bad enemy AI is still present. There's absolutely no reason to use the grind cable launcher for its intended use, actually grinding on it, because as soon as you let go of the fire button, your character zips over to the other side. So you might as well take turns using it like that. And then there's how the players needs to stay within a certain proximity of each other in order not to get blown up. Unless one of you are on a grind rail for some reason, which begs the question of, if you can explore the entire level and successfully get to the end on your own, as long as the other player is grinding on a rail at the literal start of the level, then why even limit the distance between them? Still though, everything works so much better in co-op than in single player that it's hard to conclude that this game wasn't made with co-op in mind, and then had a sudden shift near the end of development when they realized a pure co-op Ratchet and Clank game wouldn't sell and had to shoehorn in the combat bots in order to make the game work as a single player experience also. Sadly, this realization would not discourage them from making another attempt, however. As a side effect of this shift, they completely discarded any kind of complex door unlocking puzzles, and it was by goddamn time. Not having any kind of Theraguise, Electrolyzer, Trespasser, or any other gadget that immediately takes you out of the flow upon use is the best decision they have ever made for one of these games. For what is here though, from the gadgets to the weapons, it all makes sense when viewed through the lens of having another player with you to act as support. Like, you can have one character use the damaging weapons while the other uses the shields and mines to build a defensive perimeter without sacrificing the flow of the game like you would when doing the same thing in single player. Hell, without the combat bots constantly shooting and everything, you might even get the chance to use the Brainwash Omega mod on enemies a bit more effectively. The multiplayer aspect even extends to the vehicles, which there are 4 different kinds of. It's speculated that these are carryovers from an earlier shift in the game's core design, where it was supposed to be a vehicle combat game, kinda like Twisted Metal. But this idea was apparently abandoned once the team learned that a similar game, Jack X, was in development over at Naughty Dog. It's never been explicitly stated that these vehicle ideas specifically were going to be used in the racing game, and there's conflicting information about just how far along the vehicle ideas for the other game were, but knowing what we know about Gladiator's development, it's hard not to draw some very convincing parallels between the two. Still though, in their current forms, it's not reasonable to say with 100% certainty that these were completely recycled and shoved into the game. They might have drawn a lot of inspiration from their earlier work, but these vehicles are more in line with the type of game Gladiator is, and most importantly, there's only really one new type of vehicle that hasn't been used in an earlier game. The Stalker is a uniquely combat-oriented vehicle. Whereas the other 3 are used for a mix of both combat and traversal, this spider tank-ish vehicle is very slow to maneuver. But despite that, it's for some reason used in a lot of big levels with a lot of traveling, and that gets kinda boring. In single player, you can shoot the machine guns with R1 and change the mortars with L1, the latter of which is your main source of damage. While charging the mortars, you're able to lock onto up to a set number of enemies equal to the number of mortars you're able to fire. If you're targeting just one enemy, all the mortars will fly towards that one. If targeting 2, they will be split between them, and so on. The Stalker is slow. Painfully so. Not just moving it around, but also charging its mortars. I suppose this is why when playing co-op that one player is relegated to just the mortars and can aim freely all around the level without affecting the lower half and Gatling guns that are controlled by the other player. This is extremely advantageous, not only during firefights, but also during the many point challenges where you have to destroy different targets for different amounts of points. It's not impossible in single player, of course, but these spheres are often kind of hidden, so just having 2 separate viewpoints really helps. You'll also often be pitted against turrets and other Landstalkers, and here's another piece of evidence for the co-op first theory, because simply pressing a button to have the bots throw out an EMP grenade is so much less engaging than sending out a player to do it. There's little to no risk sending out a bot because you're still safe and can move the vehicle. Not to mention that even if one of the bots dies, you can just press the button again to have the other one make an attempt while the first one revives. A player can also die, but in that case you need to wait longer for a respawn, and as player 2 isn't in the vehicle, player 1 needs to decide between moving the tank and operating the mortars. In co-op, you can't do both at the same time as a single player. This is also true for both the Puma and the hovership. We're already well accustomed to these two from the previous game, except the hovership now has a multi-lock-on missile launcher. This doesn't save it from, yet again, being horribly boring though. What I will say is that the Puma is much better utilized here than in 3, but that's about the only positive thing I can say about it. Returning from Ratchet and Clank 2, there's also the hoverbike. There is no secondary weapon for this one, so Insomniac went fuck it and just added a second one for player 2. These are used exclusively for races or race-like challenges. I really like them. Some people think they're hard or confusing to control, but once you get used to moving both sticks in order to go the direction you want, it's pretty good. The Puma and hovership are also used for their own respective races. For some reason, but they don't work nearly as well as the hoverbike. The Puma doesn't have even close to the same handling as the bike, and the course is basically mostly a straight line because of it, while the hovership moves a bit too slow for there to be any excitement in the picture. They also keep insisting on spawning enemies in these races, but they're more set dressing than anything else. There's like one time you might slightly graze one of them during the hovership race, but other than that, they're mostly out to the sides and out of the way. I think they added enemies because of Insomniac's insistence on never giving the player a quiet moment, but literally no one is going to stop and kill enemies for no reason when they're on a time limit. Weirdly enough, I don't think the vehicles here are as disruptive to the game as in Ouya. I think it might have something to do with how expectations are laid out compared to the previous game. Ratchet & Clank 3 was expected to be more of Ratchet & Clank, right? At least more in line with what we got with 1 and 2. But instead we got battlegrounds and arena stuff mostly, with some classic gameplay dispersed in between. Expectations for Gladiator were already dampened, not just because of the change in direction for 3, but also because of the marketing. They just fully removed Clank from the title, and the tonal differences in the commercials and trailers are, well, I think they speak for themselves.
Awesome titanium armor. Killer robot friends. Mind-blowing weapons. And a serious set of problems.
In addition, the game is much more focused than 3. Level design is still very linear. In fact, the announcers will make fun of you if you try to explore during the one place in the game there seems like there could actually be something.
Folks, what is this sneaky Lombax doing behind the arena? This could be nothing. It's nothing, he's getting ammo.
Challenges are also presented in very short bursts, but most importantly, there's a huge amount of variety here. An arena-type challenge will never be followed by another arena-type challenge, at least not without some kind of additional rule or gimmick that changes up the entire feel and flow of the game, and the same is true for literally all the other level types. Except for the final gauntlet, where you'll go through essentially the same level 3 times. I have no idea what happened here. You'll go from linear level to arena to linear to vehicle, but it's always signposted in a way where you know what's coming. If you watched my Up Your Arsenal video, the biggest criticism I had about the level design was that it never felt like you were playing through a level, but instead mostly going from isolated challenge to isolated challenge. Ironically, Gladiator, the game that was supposed to consist of mainly the arena and battleground design that plagued the flow of 3, feels much more like 1 and 2. The challenges are short, but it's like running through a classic Ratchet & Clank level in piecemeal. Even 1 and 2 had sections that deviated from the platforming design at their core, like 1's hoverboard races and 2's arena and spaceship sections, but there were also always platforming sections that led up to them, and those sections was the main focus. In Ouya, it's not uncommon for the game to throw you into the same arena multiple times in a row throughout the course of an entire planet, or have you go through the same areas multiple times, with vehicles like the hovership or the Puma popping up for seemingly no other reason than to show off the fact that they made them, paired with level design that rarely worked in their favor. In contrast, the level design in Gladiator is more tailored to pretty much everything that happens in the game. Whether or not this is just a lucky coincidence, I don't know. I guess my trust in Insomniac to make something good isn't exactly at an all-time high at this point, but no matter what the reason, coincidence or not, the level design still works. Running through these levels, barring some of the vehicle sections, is so much more fun than playing through 3. There is a lot of combat in these levels, yes, but they still manage to throw in some platforming here and there, especially during the ranked tournaments. They even managed to bring back the grind rails, and while none of these sections ever reaches the heights of 1 or 2's grind rails, just having them there makes such a huge difference in the overall enjoyment, if only just because you're not running on some flat surface everywhere. They also incorporated some sort of combat challenge into most of the grind rails because of course they did, but these end up either as a test of reaction time and hitting the enemies before they can shoot you, or just a platforming challenge where you need to jump over the shots, though some of these shots can be near impossible to avoid. So in reality, they're just adding some slightly needed spice to these sections, seeing as they are, along with the levels themselves, also mostly very linear experiences. Adding spice to its levels and challenges is arguably what Gladiator does best, but nothing showcases this better than the arena and dread challenges. I think Insomniac realized that having arena battles be essentially fighting a different number of waves of enemies each time got old pretty quickly. So instead they introduced quirks like rotating weapons, only being able to use weapons you pick up from the ground, different variations of timed challenges, gadget focused battles, and this insane one near the end where you get faster the more enemies you defeat. And none of these are used more than once within the arena, maybe a couple of times in different levels, but never to the lengths that these ideas stop feeling fresh and fun. In fact, I wish they'd use them even more. Even without these modifiers, the different dread challenges that doesn't involve the Puma, Landstalker, or the hovership are all extremely fun, which makes it so sad that they taper off in numbers towards the end. The Ghost Station, the final unique location, doesn't even have a single one. Dread challenges aren't there just to be fun, though. They're part of the progression system and gives you extra dread points after completion, which, along with campaign medals, you'll need a certain number of to unlock the next planet or tournament. The requirements are very lenient though, so even if you don't do the worst vehicle ones, you're almost guaranteed to be able to progress. The only letdown I can think of with the levels is how they treat the gravity boots. I usually like these sections, but in Gladiator, I completely forgot that they were a thing. You unlock them after the campaign in the Valix belt, but they won't see any use until Meraxes, a whole 4 campaigns later. And the reason you need them is to walk up this tiny ledge. And the worst part is that this is basically the most you'll see of them. It's actually hilarious how they even included these. I'm getting some real Warpad vibes out of them this time around. You'd maybe think that you could go back and explore some hidden areas or something with them, but no. In fact, the levels are so linear that the devs couldn't manage to hide any collectibles in them this time. So instead they gave each planet 15 skill points each. I find these totally pointless. They're not like the skill points of days past. They barely even register as something you need skills to accomplish. I mean, I got like 11 of them in one of the levels by pure chance, and I hadn't even looked at the skill point list yet at that time. Most of them are like those Xbox achievements you'd get from simply booting up a game. Some of them can be hard to get, though it doesn't help that you're getting an explanation for how to unlock them all from the skill points menu. But most of them are just a sorry excuse for padding in the place of actual cleverly hidden secrets, which again would not be possible considering the linearity of the levels. From an in-universe perspective though, linear level design like this works well considering Ratchet is supposed to be competing in a TV show, and you wouldn't want your contestants rolling around in the mud behind some uneventful building, after all. I think that's pretty much all the whole TV aspect brings to the table here though, that and the announcers commenting on everything.
You know, sometimes I think I should have taken that job on Annihilation Nation. They've got a great demo plan.
Again.
You know, sometimes I think I should have taken that job on Annihilation Nation.
And again.
You know, sometimes I think I should have taken that job.
And again.
You know, sometimes.
Oh, and all the different gimmicks with the arena challenges also fits right into the theming, I guess. Other than that though, at least for the gameplay part, there are no real standout tie-ins, except for the story of course, which obviously revolves around this TV show theme. Despite it being very bare bones, in fact it gets thinner and thinner the longer the game goes on for, I actually enjoy what little there is of story here. In short, Gleeman Vox, the head of the Vox Industries media empire, runs a seemingly very profitable business, one of which's cornerstones is the underground holovision show Dread Zone. The whole idea behind the show is capturing heroes from throughout the universe and having them fight to the death in live gladiator battles, mostly against their will, in order to reach the top for a chance at freedom. Vox is obviously making a ton of money on this, not only on advertisements, I presume, we never really see any advertisements for products other than Vox Industries stuff, and merchandise based on the most popular gladiators. It's very similar to the story in Ratchet and Clank 1 in the sense that they are leaning very much into the whole capitalism bad angle, but in a slightly different way, which makes it feel fresher than if they were just recycling the story beats one to one. With that said, there are some very obvious similarities. The highest ranked gladiator is Ace Hardlight, and as such he's the one the company is spending the most resources on, from screen time to merch. But apparently, despite his high rank, he's among the least popular gladiators, so nothing with his name on it actually sells. In that sense, he might be somewhat of a fallen hero. You might already see where I'm going with this. There are some very strong parallels between Drek and Quark and Vox and Ace that are just impossible not to notice. Unlike Quark, Ace is being portrayed as a bad guy from the very start, but Ratchet apparently used to look up to him as a hero, so there might be some lingering feeling of respect there. However, in a similar situation to when Quark drops the duo into the lair of the Blargian Snagglebeast, Ace makes the transition to actual villain when he shoots Al in the head for tampering with the explosive collars that's keeping the contestants, along with him, Clank and Ratchet, of course, imprisoned. Also, after his defeat, he kinda has a, not moment of redemption exactly, but like how Quark, who once his affiliation with Drek gets cut because he ultimately failed to get rid of Ratchet and Clank, gets more neutral, Ace out of nowhere gets presented as this remorseful guy who only became like this because of Gleam and Vox's negative influence.
Ratchet! Don't let Vox do to you what he did to me. You're the hero now.
This kind of storyline is fine, but Ace's character isn't fleshed out enough in the course of the game to make this sudden heel turn even remotely believable. And this lack of a proper story is noticeable for everything in the entire game. But the ones that got it the worst, and is also the most noticeable, are the background stories for the bosses. Shellshock is actually pretty well done, but then again, he's the only one that gets much of anything besides Ace. He gets an introduction video, he gets a live on-air interview, he gets a sick entrance cutscene, as well as multiple faces and reappearances during the level where you fight him, where he gets to show off his many different attacks, and he even gets a short death animation. You wouldn't think that's special, but well, you'll see. It's also a really fun fight, though maybe they could have cut down on the faces a bit, because he appears a whole 2 times before you fight him for real, and then he has 4 faces inside the Kronos Cathedral. Dude actually might have more screen time than Ace Hardlight in total. This guy was designed by Mike Stout, who apparently has some signature moves that he puts in all the boss fights he designs. Normally I'd call this out as horrible game dev behavior, but they actually work kinda well off each other. The bouncing bomblets, ground shockwave, and targeted rockets perfectly complements the normal ranged shots and makes you unable to hide behind the holoshields for the most part, forcing you to move around a bit, and I really appreciate that, especially considering how the next boss works. Reactor actually gets some backstory in the form of a cutscene and then a short in-engine cutscene right before you fight him to show off his personality a bit, but it's not even close to the amount of screen time Shellshock gets. Then it's the fight itself, which stands in stark contrast to Shellshock's, since you can just chill behind a shield wall for the entire fight and be fine, because 3 out of his 4 attacks are ranged based. So as long as you make sure to move a little bit to the side once he does his charging attack, you'll be fine. And then, when you finally defeat him, he doesn't even get a death animation, it just cuts away. But it gets worse. The Eviscerator doesn't even get a single cutscene until his introduction. In fact, he's barely mentioned, with the only time you see him otherwise being during the TCG advertisement near the start of the game. Even during his introduction, Ratchet is the one who gets the most attention, with Juanita only describing the Eviscerator as a master of disembowelment and a fantastic chef, and the fight itself is just as forgettable. This guy disappears faster than he appears. You might be thinking that the reason for the bosses getting less and less attention is because Dreadzone wants to milk Ratchet's popularity, but at this point they're still trying to paint him as the bad guy. In fact, there are like 3 separate cutscenes that are dedicated to try and smear his reputation by making up horrible stuff about him in an, I'd imagine, desperate attempt to get people to buy more merch from the already established gladiators. The problem with these cutscenes is that they already, by the first one, are making such outrageous claims that they don't manage to top them during the other 2, which makes them feel like a huge waste of time that they could use on, I don't know, the other characters maybe? A big part of why they don't have time to flesh out the characters more is also directly linked to the amount of levels there are. After the Avenger tournament, there's at most only 2 planets between each tournament, which are where you fight the bosses, and this means that there are at most 4 level transitions, which is where these cutscenes are played, that can be used for adding to the backstories, but most of them are used to either further the plot or stupid stuff like those anti-Ratchet propaganda videos. These attempts at libel ultimately doesn't work, of course, and Ratchet ends up as the most popular Gladiator, and after the defeat of Ace, he's offered his previous position as the face of Dreadzone. Ratchet denies, of course, and then gets put through a gauntlet designed to kill him, except it doesn't, before he heads to what he thinks is the control room for the Deadlocked colors, but uh-oh, surprise, it was a ploy all along. In another nod to the original game, or maybe they just straight up knowingly stole it, who knows, Vox himself takes to the battlefield in order to not stop Ratchet or anything, but in a desperate attempt to raise ratings. Dude literally rigs his entire empire to explode just to make the show more popular. This never made sense to me. He might as well have just kept Ratchet there against his will. Even if he wouldn't agree to working for him, he'd still have to defend himself if he wanted to keep breathing. And even then, he still has two very valuable hostages in Clank and the newly returned half-robot Al. Yeah, Al returning is really fucking stupid, by the way. And not only makes zero sense, because why would they bring back someone who successfully managed to disarm a collar, but it also plays down any kind of stake that was established with his death. The sudden turn of the announcers, Dallas and Juanita, totally turning into Ratchet supporters the moment they themselves are in danger, feels kinda weird, but it's natural given the setting, I guess. Gleeman Vox as the final boss was expected, but it's a really fun one. He has a myriad of attacks, from summoning ghost enemies to normal shots to ground lasers you have to jump over. There's nothing in this fight that you can simply negate with a shield or something. It's a pretty good final test of your skills. The whole aesthetic side of the fight is pretty cool too, with Vox flying around in a huge robot with TV screens on it that are showing his face on them during the last phase. For what it's worth, despite all the negative things I've said, I still think this story works for what it is. The lack of a fleshed out story, or just a story in itself in some cases, is because of the short length and nature of the game. In 3, even if they weren't all that, you'd have short cutscenes during and or at the end of levels that serve the purpose of fleshing out the characters, or game in general. In Gladiator, character interactions, especially between Ratchet and a second party, are almost non-existent. Somehow there's even less than in 3, but a lot of the dialogue at the start of levels especially serves to fill in a bit of this gap, despite being mostly superficial.
Folks, we're live tonight from the planet of Kronos, where Commander Shellshock and his army have taken over the city and don't like visitors. Ratchet will fight to keep Team Darkstar alive, while Clank tries not to get him lost. What? Clink? Clank? Oh, Clank, that's what I said. Well, it doesn't matter, because Team Darkstar is about to become Team Deadstar. Oh, will they survive long enough to enter the foreboding Dark Cathedral? If so, Shellshock will be there to finish them off for good. Place your bets, everybody, because we're going straight to the action.
The cathedral is completely locked down, but I have found a weakness. 2 giant spotlights lie dormant nearby. If you activate them, their beams will trigger a solar sensor on the temple and unlock the door. According to my nav grid, the spotlights are in separate sections of the city. Good luck, Ratchet.
If there's one thing I wish there were more of, it's the intro cutscenes to the different planets, like what you'd often get in 1 and 2. I think 3 were mostly devoid of this, if I remember correctly, which is a shame because they brought a lot of charm and world building to the games. The only cutscene of this nature for Gladiator that I can think of off the top of my head is the one that precedes Planet Stygia. It's a really interesting look into the planet itself, and also how Dreadzone's intervention affects it. It feels a lot like the Infobot cutscene you get for Planet Tabora in 2, actually. For what it's worth though, I still think most of the pre-rendered cutscenes here are really strong and mostly very funny. Dallas and Juanita especially totally carries most of the humor of this game.
I'll bet he doesn't have any trouble getting a close shave, Juanita. You get it?
Shut up, Dallas, you're not that funny.
For me, Gladiator falls into the surprisingly fun, despite having a lot of obvious problems category of games. The story is obviously what's lacking the most here, but ultimately it doesn't have that much of an impact on the game as a whole. It's not story-driven to the point that the previous ones were, so while having a robust background for the boss characters would be nice, it's enough to know that 1. Ratchet and Clank are trapped, and 2. They need to fight their way out. Having weapons that you can freely customize was a good idea, but the execution didn't hold up. It doesn't really matter how much you can customize something when it's not necessary or baked into the gameplay. The way the Omega mods work are great, but there's still a very obvious tier list, and not all of them works as intended. Upgrading your weapons has always been at the forefront for these games, but having them upgrade all the way to level 10 was a step too far in its current iteration, and being able to go to 99 pushes it way over the boundaries of what was even the point of upgrading the weapons in the first place. While staple rack mechanics like puzzles and hidden secrets are missing, I think this works in the game's favor, especially considering how these have been mishandled in the previous games. A lot of them were fun, but the majority were simply in the way on repeat playthroughs. The skill points are embarrassing and borderline insulting to a longtime fan, but they don't actually take anything away from the game. They're just kinda there in the background if you decide not to engage with them. They do unlock some cheats though, but these are mostly cosmetic or not worth your time. Speaking of, Ratchet's model has seen a severe downgrade here. I do think his more angular design fits in with the overall mood, but having his face be obscured throughout most of the game, combined with the lack of a bobbing tail, really anonymizes him. Now that Clank has been placed on the sidelines, the only things that are recognizable about Ratchet are his general stature and pointy ears. But because of the helmet, that might just be a design choice that was made to have the helmet be more similar to the Dread Zone logo. Even his running cycle feels very un-Ratchety. There's no fluid moment, it's all stiff and robotic. During normal gameplay, you might as well be playing as some random competitor. Hell, Ratchet doesn't even have a single speaking line during the levels. Though this is more because of the lack of characters to interact with, unlike in previous games. The vehicles are a mixed bag, but they're utilized much better than in 3. The Puma, for example, is actually used for more than 10 seconds at a time here thanks to the layout of the big open levels. And while I still don't like the hovership, I can't deny that it's more fun than the one in 3. Slightly. Another point about the open vehicle levels, which is also loosely related to not ever having to exit the vehicles when you can let the bots do all the work, is that the access to vehicles in pretty much all of these big areas completely removes the need for a sniper weapon. Also relating to the vehicles, getting hit while in one will reset your bolt multiplier. While not that big of an issue in most of them, because of its low speed and large frame, getting damaged while in the Stalker is unavoidable, and any mission involving it would be a death sentence for your multiplier in challenge mode. Speaking of, certain enemies have near undiscernible attacks that will come at you from seemingly out of nowhere. This is thankfully a relatively rare occurrence, but it does happen. Most of the boss fights are fun, but Reactor and Ace are too easily countered by the Holoshield launcher. Ace's Kagebunshin no Jitsu could work as a way to negate that, but his clones rarely spread out enough for them to be any real threat. Combat in general is really fun, but lock strafing still sucks except for in multiplayer PvP. It doesn't feel like the game is made for it despite lock strafing being the default control method. You have so much more range of motion and snappier controls when playing in third person that it's hard to justify going into lock strafe for the added aiming, which you honestly don't need at all. And don't even get me started on first person mode. That said, there are a lot of things that this game does better than, or at the very least, just as good as the previous ones. Despite what I've already said about the different control modes, the game still controls just as well as the other titles. There's of course some very obvious differences in the movement area since Clank isn't available, and that sucks a little, but for what it's worth, I didn't miss it that much, especially since they didn't make that good of a use of him in 3. The UI in these games are usually very minimalistic, but they always manage to get their point across, even here where there's a lot more stuff that can be engaged with. The bot commands are relegated to the D-pad in a tiny graphic down in the left corner, but since they're context sensitive, they rarely need to use more than one button at a time. The weapons have always been a big part of the games, and despite the lacking amount of them this time around, they are mostly pretty good. In fact, Gladiator has some of my favorite iterations of the series' weapon types up to this point. Sure, there are some duds, but while they don't work well in single player, they do work better in local co-op, which is a really fun addition to the experience. Speaking of additions, an actual difficulty system that's not just operating in the background. There are 4 levels of difficulty that you can choose from to begin with the hardest one only being unlocked on a save that has reached challenge mode. I played on the base difficulty 2-star contestant mode for the most part of the initial gameplay recording, and didn't actually die until the Ace Hardlight fight, and that was the only time, bar falling out of the level or something, so the default isn't that hard. After reaching challenge mode, I tried the 5-star Exterminator difficulty. Also, in challenge mode, they don't use the scaling difficulty steps that alters the game depending on how well or bad you play, and instead gives you the highest possible difficulty within each level constantly, so choosing Exterminator will always give you the highest possible difficulty for the game. The problem is that by this point you're so used to the game and already have most of the useful weapons fully upgraded to V10 at least, and you have access to the Harbinger, so the difference in difficulty isn't as steep as you'd think. Even the last boss isn't that hard. So for the toughest challenge, you'll want to go with the 4-star hero difficulty on a fresh save. The way the difficulty works here is that each level has more and tougher enemies than the last, which is a great fit for this type of game. It's really fun, but if you're as familiar with the game as I am, it's more manageable than difficult, even when you don't buy the weapons you don't like the Holoshield launcher. Do buy the Hunter Mine Launcher though, because getting through the Mines Only challenge in the Crusader tournament with the level 1 version of a weapon that wouldn't even gain EXP because you never bought it was a bitch. This is why they should have had the option to access a vendor screen before every arena challenge, like in the previous games. There's not really any reward for playing at a higher difficulty though. You get more stars from challenges that can be used for unlocking skins that you can use in single player and co-op, but for monetary gain, the only added benefit would be a bit more bolts from the increased number of enemies, but I don't think that has any noticeable effect even in the long run. The bolt rewards you get from challenges are all the same, so playing at a higher difficulty is only in order to have a bit more resistance. While we're talking about difficulty, there's never a huge spike like in 2 and 3. It's all progressing very smoothly, and because of that your weapons will never truly fall off like they did in 2 specifically. Some of this might have to do with the length of the game, being another part that was saved instead of ruined by the limited dev time they had, I guess, and the different Omega mods. The last thing I had in mind is the visual level design. Insomniac really does know how to make a good looking level, and judging by the way the camera is placed at the start of them, they know it. Just like in every Ratchet and Clank game, there's a ton of variety here. You'll end up visiting a bunch of different planets, and while the enemy variety is kinda lacking, consisting mostly of a few variations of Dreadzone robots, the environments are not. The Dreadzone space station itself is a really cool futuristic-y hub, Catacomb 4 is an overgrown ruins site, Serathos is a huge swamp, Kronos is a giant city with a huge cathedral in the center, Shar is an icy seaside area with a big temple where most of the action takes place, Orxon doesn't actually remind you that much of the original location, I guess, and is probably the most boring one.
Sir, permission to speak freely? This place stinks.
But the Valix Belt is a big space station with lighthouses. Torval is an industrial, almost steampunk, formerly deserted planet until Gleam and Vox rebuilt it and used it as a toy factory for Dreadzone merch. Stygia is a giant control station way up in the sky where lightning strikes every other second. Meraxis is a desert planet and was once a high security prison where the worst criminals in the Solana galaxy was sent. And then there's the Ghost Station, a space station full of the ghost of your formerly vanquished foes. Oh, and if you think these locations looks cool in-game, you owe yourself to go and check out the concept art, because god damn, some of these are downright amazing. And it's not just the visual aspect that's amazing, but also the audio, or more specifically the music. Compared to the tracks in 3 that almost melded into each other from being so similar, the music in Gladiator has some actual variety to it from level to level. Also, I have to give special mention to the track Challenge Complete that plays during the results screen for the end of every challenge. There's no reason for this track to be over 50 seconds long, but the composer, David Bourgault, who also did the previous games, must have known that this was a certified banger and would have people wanting to listen as long as possible. Despite Gladiator doing this much, it still isn't a Ratchet and Clank game you'd imagine after having played 1 or 2. But it does move the needle a little bit backwards from the shit show that was Ouya. Not just for how well it handles the weapons, the level design, and the general story despite it being very thin, but also because they managed to bring back the grind rails and didn't allocate 90% of the platforming to the arena obstacle courses that were mostly just the same 2 courses over and over again. The same old problem with the lack of time still haunts Insomniac at this point, clearly given how short the game is. But for the first time since the original Ratchet and Clank, I actually feel like they managed to spend their time wisely here. Unlike Up Your Arsenal, Gladiator isn't filled to the brim with bloated content that doesn't fit with the core game. It feels way more focused. They're not trying to do a little bit of everything and failing at it. They're using the time they have to make an actual coherent game with less content, yes, but higher quality content also. They removed everything they didn't need in order to meet the deadline, and while they did this at the cost of having fewer characters, weapons, and story beats in the game, I think they made up for it by creating a really solid core gameplay loop with a lot of fun and interesting challenges and locations. They even ditched Quark, which I never would have believed for even a second. Well, he does get a surprisingly funny special appearance in the ending cutscene, but still.
Ratchet, Clank, it's me, Captain Quark. There's a nasty rumor going around about heroes being kidnapped, but don't worry, it's baloney. I mean, come on, nobody came to capture me, right? Just imagine making a show about galactic heroes without Captain Quark. Ha!
I really like Gladiator, and not even the last-minute appearance of Dr. Nefarious managed to spoil the game for me, and I think that speaks for something. Oh, hey, thank you for watching all the way until the end. I really appreciate that. As always, I try to incite some sort of discussion about the games I cover, so if you have any thoughts either on the game or the video itself, then don't hesitate to leave a comment and tell me about what's on your mind. Hey, if you liked the video, make sure to give it a like and maybe share it on some obscure subreddit or something. And if you want to watch the other Ratchet and Clank analyses I've made, there's a link to the playlist with them on screen right now. I'm really happy with how these have turned out so far. Oh, and I need to give a huge special thanks to my 2 channel supporters on the Supporter Plus tier, Prod by Quick on YouTube and Tabriz on Patreon. Thank you. If you want to support me financially as well and get your name read in the end of my videos, among other benefits, there is a link in the description to the Patreon and a link to become a YouTube member, whichever you might want to use.